Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this TDL webinar on launching the Texas Data Repository. My name is Christy Park. I'm the director of the Texas Digital Library, and I'm joined today by Santee Thompson, who is the head of Digital Repository Services at the University of Houston Libraries, and is also the chair of the Dataverse Implementation Working Group. Since about a year ago, since September of 2015, that working group that Santee has led has worked with TDL staff to pilot and implement a consortial repository for sharing and archiving research data, as well as to develop policies and workflow documentation associated with a data repository service. So now we're ready to begin working with our members to implement this service on their campuses. And in this webinar, we'll discuss, the work that we've done so far and how our members can get ready to offer the service to faculty and staff on their campuses. This is a look at today's agenda. I will start out by talking about some background on the Texas Data Repository and then turn it over to Santee to talk about the capabilities of Dataverse, which is the repository platform that we're using, and how the overall service will work. Then I'll talk about local implementation and about the information that our members will need to get the service set up on their campuses, and then wrap things up. We should have time to answer questions at the end. We think, about 40 or so minutes of content, and then we'll have plenty of time to hear from you all, your questions. We are using just computer audio today rather than our conference line, so if you have questions, we encourage you to put them in the chat window here in Adobe Connect. And even as you think of them, go ahead and enter them there, and as we have an appropriate moment, we'll pause and answer them. We are also recording this webinar today, and we'll make it available on our YouTube channel, which you'll be able to get to from the tdl.org website. So, starting with some background. The TDL has, since its inception, really supported greater access to scholarly communication through a number of hosted services. We host DSpace institutional repositories, open access journals, an ETD publishing platform. We have 22 member institutions of varying sizes and flavors all across the state of Texas. And in the past few years, our members have consistently expressed to us their need for support from TDL for infrastructure and services for research data management. Those expressed needs have been driven by funders and government agencies, advocacy groups, and others pushing for improved accessibility and usability of research data and other research outputs. And this increased focus on data sharing and reuse was famously accelerated by the 2013 OSTP directive that required plans from federal agencies to support increased public access to the results of the research that they fund. And so as we started at TDL thinking about what services we could provide for our members, we had a number of goals. And first and foremost, among the goal for any repository service that we offered was to help researchers comply with those funding mandates, to provide them with infrastructure for compliance at the end of the research process, and also for data management planning at the beginning of that process. Additionally, we wanted the service to facilitate greater recognition for research data and for researchers through the assignment of unique persistent identifiers in the form of DOIs, and to provide enhanced discoverability of that data. And finally, we hope very much that improved infrastructure for data sharing, including this repository, but including a whole host of other infrastructure projects that are going on within the academic library ecosystem, will ultimately produce better research by enabling sharing of reproducible results and making the research process more efficient. So those are the goals for the end users of the service, for researchers, faculty. For our direct stakeholders, which are our academic library members, we wanted to offer a service that would enable their participation in the research data lifecycle in a way that's flexible and mutually beneficial so that any institution, regardless of its own staff resources, can use the service. And finally, we want to enable libraries to help their institutions showcase the research outputs produced by faculty, staff, and students on their campuses. So I'll say next a few words about the process of doing this work, and I won't go into too much depth about it. You can read more about it in the Dataverse Implementation Working Group's report that was just released last week and is available in the TDL DSpace repository. But we won't spend a ton of time today going through all the steps of this process. But I do think it's important to acknowledge the really amazing work of a big number of people over a couple of different working groups and several years of work to help TDL and work with TDL to develop these services. To get ourselves started, we convened an exploratory working group in 2013 to investigate possibilities for consortial services. That group issued a report last fall, or at the end of last summer, I guess, August 2014 or 15, recommending the use of Dataverse as a platform for a consortial data repository. And Bruce Herbert from Texas A&M Libraries chaired that group and led that work. As a direct result of that group's recommendations, we formed the TDL Dataverse Implementation Working Group in September of 2015 under Santi's leadership to address all aspects of building a consortial data repository service, including policies, workflows, technology configuration, costs and business models, metadata, and outreach. This has, as you can see, been a big effort involving a lot of people, a lot of individual and institutional support. Not all of it represented here on these slides, and I want to thank all our members who participated in both of these groups for contributing their hard work and expertise to this process, particularly Santi and Bruce, who have been great leaders for us in this work. The Dataverse Implementation Working Group formed a year ago, as I said, and had a pretty ambitious timeline for getting these services off the ground. It organized itself into subgroups that were focused on addressing 4 objectives: budgeting and a business plan, policy and governance, technical configuration, and workflows and outreach. They divided their work into 2 broad phases, with the completion and assessment of a pilot project serving as a unifying activity across those phases. In that first phase, in the fall of 2015 leading into the spring, the group devised draft workflows and policies and configured the repository software in preparation for the pilot project. We pursued and received approval from the institutional review boards of our respective institutions to proceed with the pilot, which took place in the spring of 2016, where we had researchers and librarians from a number of institutions test out the repository and give us feedback through a survey instrument about its utility. You can read more about that project and the results in the working group report, which I mentioned. So we're now in a soft launch phase in which we're beginning to talk to our members, like today in this webinar, about this service and getting people ready to use it. And we'll use this fall to educate our members and refine the service and we've planned an event in November, the first of what we hope will be a regular fall symposium on November 15th and 16th at Baylor Libraries, to start building a community of practitioners around research data management. We're really excited about that event. We're working towards a formal launch of the service in December of this year. And so next we'll talk about the product of all this work, the Texas Data Repository, which is a platform for publishing and archiving data sets and other data products created by faculty, staff, and students at Texas higher education institutions. The TDR, as we'll refer to it frequently throughout this webinar, is a single repository hosted by TDL and TDL staff, but managed collectively by our member institutions. You can see here a screenshot of the website homepage that we've created as a front end to the repository software, and which also includes our documentation policies, workflow documentation, etc. And that website is at data.tdl.org. Importantly, I'll mention this here and we'll mention it again a couple of other times. The repository only accepts de-identified research data. It is not intended for data with sensitive or confidential information like social security numbers, even if that data remains unpublished in the repository. It is built, as I mentioned, in open source Dataverse, originally developed and in use by Harvard University. And Santi is now going to talk a little bit about that platform and its capabilities as we've configured it for TDL and its members. So I will turn it over to him now.
Well, thank you, Christy, and welcome everyone. So my portion of the webinar will focus on sharing information about the repository, and we'll begin by discussing some of the capabilities and benefits of the underlying software, which is Dataverse. So part of the presentation will cover a variety of benefits of the repository, including the things listed here: data storage and sharing, data versioning, permissions in terms of use, measuring impact and tracking use, discipline-based metadata schema, and data visualization. So we'll start our discussion with some definitions. To understand the functionality and capabilities of the repository, you must first come to know the term Dataverse. Most broadly, a Dataverse is a home for your research project, for your community, and for your data. One instance of the term reflects the name of the software that underlies our repository, the TDR. But another instance of the term corresponds to a container of content. This kind of Dataverse is represented by the cubes on the screen. So in this context, a Dataverse is a container for data sets, and those data sets are made up of your research data, code, documentation, and metadata. A Dataverse can also contain other Dataverses, which can be set up for individual researchers, departments, journals, and organizations. So as you can see on the diagram on the screen, you can have Dataverses, which have data sets embedded within other Dataverses. And for those familiar with DSpace, you can think of a Dataverse as a sort of collection. The primary function of the Texas Data Repository is to provide a mechanism for users to upload data and share their data sets as widely as they desire, from limited access within a trusted group that they designate to completely open access. Part of the storing and dissemination of data includes the user's ability to generate versions of the uploaded data, ensuring that the evolution of their work is documented and, if so desired, made available. So in this screenshot, we see the versions interface, which provides information on 3 different versions of the John Doe dataset. The user has the ability to select various versions and view the differences between them, as the green highlighted areas to the left and to the right of the slide indicate. Additionally, those browsing can view details about individual versions, which the center green box indicates. In addition to tracking versions, the repository also maintains and displays any terms of use or permissions granted to the dataset. This information is accessed through the Terms tab as shown by the upper red arrow. By default, published data is assigned a CC0 license so that others may freely access and build upon the work. This designation is highlighted by the lower red arrow on the screen. According to the Creative Commons website, CC0 indicates that, and I'm quoting now, the person who associated a work with this deed has dedicated the work to the public domain by waiving all of his or her rights to the work worldwide under copyright law, including any related and neighboring rights to the extent allowed by law. As such, a user can copy, modify, distribute, and perform the work, even for commercial purposes, all without asking permission, end quote. But note that the researcher can alter this license and create custom terms of use for their data as desired. Audience members should also note that the interface reminds the user that any data reused from TDR should be appropriately cited. The TDR community norms spell out the pieces of such a citation in detail, and those are available on the TDR website. Citation information is also included in the blue shaded box on every dataset page. Using this screenshot as an example, the lower red arrow indicates the citation, including a DOI, which is a unique and persistent identifier. Because TDR emphasizes the citation of data in the repository, and it uses unique and persistent identifiers as part of this process, the ability to track the impact of your research is possible. Additionally, the repository displays the number of downloads for each dataset, as shown by the upper red arrow on the screen. TDR also contains a guest book feature, which allows you to collect data about who is downloading the files from your dataset within a given Dataverse for which you are the administrator. You can decide to collect account information, such as the downloader's username, given name and last name, and affiliation, as well as create custom questions. For example, what do you plan to use this data for? You're also able to download the log data collected from the guestbook as Excel files to store and use outside of Dataverse. The green highlighted area on the screen shows the guestbook question customization interface. No repository would be beneficial without metadata, and TDR contains several metadata schema to help depositors describe their datasets. The most basic metadata fields generate a citation for the dataset. Pictured on this slide is a screenshot of some citation metadata. Additionally, TDR supports geospatial, social science and humanities, astronomy and astrophysics, and life sciences metadata fields and schema. These disciplinary-based metadata fields are based on established standards, vocabularies, and best practices, including fields that are compliant with the DDI codebook, DataCite, Dublin Core's DCMI metadata terms, the ISO language codes, the International Virtual Observatory Alliance's VO resource schema, the OBI ontology, and the NCBI taxonomy for organisms. The repository software will also offer visualization options for certain types of datasets. So for example, users can draw upon the two ravens, a visual tool for manipulating statistical data in tabular format, to visualize CSV, RData, and DTA files. So here is an image of a small, rather simplistic data set visualized using the two ravens tool. Other visualization tools take advantage of georeferenced and astronomy data. Additional functionality include the ability to contact the owner of any Dataverse or dataset in the Texas Data Repository through the repository software. And this is an example of that interface. Other benefits of the TDR software include the ability to integrate with OJS, so the online publication can link the data set that informed the publication, can link to the data set that informed the publication, and vice versa. Metadata in TDR will also be harvested by Share, which, and I'm quoting, gathers, cleans, links, and enhances metadata that describes research activities and outputs, from data management plans and grant proposals to preprints, presentations, journal articles, and research data. Developers will also be able to build tools to interoperate with TDR by taking advantage of the repository's APIs. Finally, a major benefit of the Texas Data Repository is that it offers a secure environment to store and share research data. The Texas Data Repository is hosted in Amazon Web Services, which provides cloud security and services and support, network monitoring and protection, and identity management and authentication. Only TDL staff maintain system-wide access to the repository, and a controlled number of member library personnel will have special privileges for administering an institutional collection of research data deposited by users from their university. These personnel will be limited to one user account per participating member institution. Additionally, TDL backs up data in TDR according to its organization-wide backup policy, and also maintains copies of data in 3 distinct locations. Now that we have a better understanding of some of the benefits of the repository, I will next discuss how the Texas Digital Library and its membership will provide services around TDR. So policies that identify the scope of the repository and the kinds of content and collections accepted into it are critical for long-term sustainability and maintenance. And the working group over many months established a lot of policies that are all available on the TDR website. The repository will focus on research data and products, such as codebooks. The repository is not intended for published papers, which are frequently found in institutional or discipline-based repositories. The repository will accept data from any discipline and with any file type. It is designed for what we're calling regular to mid-sized data sets. As such, individual file sizes up to 2 gigabytes and research projects up to 10 gigabytes total per project will be accepted. And because datasets are intended to be accessed by any number of people, no confidential or sensitive information should be contained in the data. Administering the Texas Data Repository will be done in a hybrid model. There is one single Dataverse repository hosted by the Texas Digital Library. In that model, TDL provides organizational support in the form of training, technical support, and limited coordination. Member institutions will provide services based on their local needs and resources. Their roles could include each member institution supplying a data repository librarian to manage the institutional Dataverse, act as a local expert for the repository, and serve on the TDL Data Library and Repository Steering Committee. This steering committee will help TDL recognize trends in research data management, address repository issues, and recommend future groups needed for sustaining data management support. Any data curation support will also be provided by the member institution. Under this model, the user is responsible for depositing data. However, the hybrid model is flexible enough to accommodate different processes at different institutions. For example, some libraries may require librarian intervention during ingest, some may not. Christy will talk more about the roles and responsibilities of TDL and its membership in the next section. So by default, as represented on the slide, researchers will be responsible for depositing research data. They can ingest data to personalized dataverses they have created, to their institutional dataverse, and or to the root dataverse, which is the Texas Data Repository. Audience members should note that this self-deposit process can be customized on an institution-by-institution basis. So, for example, institutions can make it so researchers do not have permission to deposit, and the member library would have to be involved in this process, as represented in the following slide. Institutions will need to contact TDL if they would like to modify the researcher self-deposit model. Okay. Finally, every TDL member institution that participates in TDR will have their own institutional dataverse, which will contain all of the dataverses and datasets produced at their respective institutions. Institutional dataverses are a way to showcase the data deposited at your institution. TDL will rely on the designated data repository librarian to maintain your institutional dataverse. So the scrolling carousel outlined in the red box on the screen gives some examples of the institutional dataverses that will be available for those browsing for content. So I'm going to pass this back over to Christy now, and I'm not sure if we're going to take questions yet or not, but in any event, she'll be discussing the next steps for implementing TDR at your respective institutions.
Thank you, Santi. Thanks for that. That's a lot of information. And we did have one question that I want to go ahead and address from A&M Libraries. And actually, we'll address a little bit on this next slide as we talk about implementation. And that's the question about the storage limits and file size limits. As Santi mentioned, there is kind of a system limit on the size of any individual file. That's 2 gigs. And if we have file sizes larger than that, then we'll have to explore workflows that for ingest that aren't through the Dataverse interface. The 10 gig project limit is currently the limit for the size of projects. So you could have multiple files within a Dataverse that are all part of the same project and are all 2 gigs or less, but we want to limit the size of the overall project to 10 gigs for now. And that's partly because of the way we're launching this, so I'll talk a little bit about that now. So we're kind of soft launching right now, and we're launching it under existing contracts with members. So this is a service available to our members under their existing contracts without additional fees in this first year as we launch the service and refine it and let the service mature a little bit. We will be using an MOU to articulate, or a memorandum of understanding to articulate the roles and responsibilities of the parties involved, and I'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. And we anticipate, as we monitor costs and usage and refine the service over the coming year, that while there will be no additional charge for use of the repository in year 1, there will be in future years as the volume of the repository grows. So we have this limit, per project limit, which is primarily there to give folks an idea of what the purpose of the repository is. It's really not currently a repository for huge data sets. If there is a need for storage beyond that 10 gig limit, we want to talk to those folks who have those use cases and figure out a way to accommodate them if we can do so. But we would have to recoup some costs for storage for data stores that large. We're also, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but we're also looking at ways that we can use the Dataverse repository as a metadata record pointing to large data sets stored elsewhere at high performance computing centers or other places that do accommodate huge data sets. I don't have an estimate right now as to, there's a question about future annual costs. I think we need to get a little further into this before we have some, internal work that's going on that, but not anything that I'm quite ready to share yet. But we will, for sure, be letting our members know in plenty of time to make decisions about future years of use for the next year. So I'll talk a little bit about the Memorandum of Understanding, which is intended to clearly identify the roles and responsibilities of the member institution and Texas Digital Library as they relate to TDR. This slide lists out the sections of that MOU, which include a set of definitions, a section on roles and responsibilities of various parties, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And it articulates the quote-unquote ownership of the repository, which is, as with all our services, UT Austin, because UT Austin serves as the lead agency for TDL. There's also a section for signatures from representatives from the member institution and from TDL. And this MOU is available for you to review in the working group report, or you can contact us and we'll send you a copy of it for your review. So the most important part of that MOU is the roles and responsibilities section, which fleshes out the different groups that Santi talked about in this diagram. So we'll use these layers as a way to talk about those roles and responsibilities. Because of the hybrid nature of the TDR service, it's really essential that institutions participating in it understand the roles and responsibilities of all the parties. And you can see at the top of this layer cake, we have TDL, which is providing the stewardship, technological oversight, upgrades, and maintenance of the data repository software and its associated websites. It will assure access to and secure backup of data submitted to the repository and coordinate a membership-wide steering committee of data repository librarians. It'll also provide technical support for all TDR users via the TDL help desk and provide training and professional development opportunities for data repository librarians. At the bottom of the stack are our researchers, of course, who deposit, share, and perhaps, we hope, publish data. They're responsible for maintaining any data that they have self-deposited and for adhering to the TDR terms of use, which they have to agree to when they begin using and depositing data to the repository. So in between those two extremes in that red area, we have the member responsibilities and roles. And there are two different sort of categories of roles there. This layer is really the true service layer for the repository. So we ask that our members appoint someone to serve as the data repository librarian, who is the liaison between TDL and the member library for the service. We ask that our members promote and support the TDR service locally and establish any institutional policies that are necessary for using the repository. And finally, we need our member institutions to help us connect with any necessary departments on campuses to get the repository service set up. So notably, we will need to integrate the repository with authentication systems on each campus via Shibboleth and we'll need someone to liaise with central IT offices or whoever is responsible for managing those systems locally. That data repository librarian role will be, as I mentioned, responsible for serving as a liaison between TDL and the member for this service. They'll also serve as a local liaison for repository users. And they'll be listed on our TDR website as the local contact for the service. And they will be responsible for maintaining the institutional Dataverses that Santi talked about. They'll also serve on the repository steering committee, which is that yellow governance layer operating between TDL and the member institution, providing advice and guidance to TDL on all matters related to the Texas Data Repository. And optionally and importantly, we hope that our members, in some cases where they're able to, will use this position and this role to provide services to campus researchers, assisting them with data curation, data management planning, or other kinds of value-added services around the repository, and that this repository will enable our members to begin providing those services, if they're not already, to their faculty and their researchers. Okay, so I'll talk a little more now about the authentication piece, and then we'll wrap up and take questions. So I mentioned before that we use Shibboleth, and that we'll need to integrate the repository with each campus's local authentication systems. We use Shibboleth for a number of services here at TDL with our DSpace hosting, Vireo hosting services. So this is something that most of our campuses are familiar with. By using Shibboleth, researchers who use this service can log in via their local institutional accounts. And from a security standpoint, this allows us to control who has access to deposit to the repository. There will be other methods for logging in, other types of accounts. For instance, we want for researchers to be able to invite non-TDL affiliated faculty from other institutions to share or collaborate in the system. Those users will not have deposit privileges by default, and data repository librarians will have a different kind of login as well. I'm not going to go into detail on the process here. This is something we will cover in detail in training and in the technical documentation. And speaking of training, I mentioned already that we're having the TDL Data Symposium next month. For the most part, the folks attending that event have been identified and invitations have been sent out. But if you have any questions about whether you should be attending, please let us know as soon as possible so we can make sure that you have a seat. We will be hosting another webinar in December. The date for that has not been set yet. But that will be a webinar that's part of the formal launch of the repository, and we'll provide additional information and instruction there. And of course, we have the user guide available on the TDR website. The link is there on the slide. So I'll spend the last few minutes here reviewing a few pieces of information and talking about our future plans for the repository, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So please be thinking of questions as we finish up here, and feel free to go ahead and enter those questions in the chat window, and we will get to them in just a minute or two. So, as you can probably tell, we've put together a good bit of documentation around this Texas Data Repository service, and this slide lists the places on the TDR website where you can find them. We have some information sheets for different audiences for the repository, the user guide, which I mentioned previously, a metadata dictionary, and all of our external policies posted on the website. We also have a set of internal policies for TDL and its librarians who are working in the service that are available, I believe, in the TDL Dataverse Implementation Working Group report. The link to the repository location for that is also on this slide. And while I'm thinking of it, I'll also mention that there is a file share pod in this Adobe Connect meeting in the bottom left-hand corner, which contains a PDF version of these slides. So if you'd like to download those to take with you, feel free to do so. And as I mentioned previously, we have a couple of events coming up throughout the fall to make sure everyone has the information they need to use the service effectively, and we're looking at a few opportunities in the spring as well for keeping momentum going and getting people excited and engaged with research data management generally and the repository specifically. Looking ahead over the next year or so, we have a list of things we want to improve and build on with the repository, and this is just a few of those things. So first and foremost, the working group in its report makes a series of recommendations related to digital preservation of data, and we want to look carefully at those and make some decisions related to the our long-term preservation policy and process related to digital preservation. We also want to look into integration with other TDL applications like Vireo, for instance, our ETD application, and with local discovery systems so that, for example, your institution could make its deposited data products discoverable through your ILS. So those are workflows and projects that we want to undertake after we get this initial soft launch underway. Finally, we are working on improving the scalability of the system by developing workflows for accommodating large data stores, which I mentioned before, most likely by using the Dataverse repository as a metadata record pointing to huge data sets hosted elsewhere, and by making sure that the systems, and we want to make sure that our systems are architected in ways that will scale up effectively as the overall volume of data in the repository grows. We've done some work on that and know we're going to need to do more. So if your institution is ready to begin the implementation process for your campus, we ask that you contact us through the TDL help desk at support@tdl.org. And when this happens, we'll provide you with the MOU and get in contact with relevant IT personnel on our campus to begin Shibboleth integration. And as I said, you can begin reviewing that MOU in the TDL Dataverse Working Group report. So that brings us to the end of our prepared presentation, and we now want to open up the floor to questions. And I know that we have one from Jasmine about the level of membership you need to have in TDL to use Dataverse. And that's a good question. So right now, at this very moment, we're focused on getting our existing members ready to implement and use the service on their campus. It is available currently to all of our members, regardless of their membership level at this point. And I think that the assessment that we do over the fall and in the early spring around cost and fee setting for the next year will help us determine what level of membership you need. We're currently assessing those membership levels across the board, and so there's some chance that there will be some shifting around of how that works. So we want to get people using it and helping us build the service and helping us refine the service over the next 6 months or so, and make some decisions about what those levels are. But right now, it's everybody who's a member of TDL. Are there other questions? Um, okay. Looks like Anna had a question. You should have microphone access now, Anna. But I'm not able to hear you. Oh,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay. Because currently in our university, the Texas A&M Corpus Christi, they have some data in the DSpace repository. Is there a way to import the DSpace data to the Dataverse?
So it's a good question. And Anna, you may need to mute your microphone because we're getting some
Okay.
echo. Thanks. So I think that it's possible for sure. I think decisions have to be made about whether, it's worth it to do that. Migrations are always a little bit of work for everybody involved. And if the data is doing fine in DSpace and DSpace is doing the work that A&M Corpus wants it to do for that data, then it can certainly reside there. Those decisions are definitely up to the local institution to make as to whether they want to move that data into a different location. But certainly possible and something we could work with you on if you wanted to do it. I do invite everybody to go to data.tdl.org and check out the documentation there. We also that link will also lead you to the repository site itself, where there is some live data in there that you can explore and take a look at to see how it looks in the repository. Thanks, Laura.
And I'll remind folks that we are technically still in a soft launch, so content on that page will evolve as we progress through the soft launch into the official launch.
Okay, Marilyn asks about the template for TDL representative. The template calls for a TDL representative, not the data repository librarian. So yes, that is a slightly outdated version. I had forgotten that. We will send a revised MOU that includes signature lines for the data repository librarian and a library administrator, as well as a TDL representative. We want to make sure all those folks are engaged in that process. And I'll just add as we wrap up, and if there are any other questions, please feel free to ask. We have several folks from our working group who have been talking with their offices of sponsored research or research offices on their campuses about this, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback through those conversations, and because this is the kind of service that they potentially are very interested in. So as our members think about using the service, we want them to be talking to those folks on their campus, put us in touch with folks on their campuses to talk about how this might help and how we might improve the service to be more useful for their needs.
So
Yes.
A&M is
Oh, go
asking,
ahead,
is there a
Santi.
test instance for us to practice with?
Yeah, so there is actually right now we do not have a sandbox, but we do have a development instance um, of the application that we could certainly share with you. I'm not going to put it in the chat window right now. I'm going to check with our technical staff to make sure that's cool with them. But we do have that instance that you could play around with a little and learn more about the software. It is, since it is a development instance, it gets brought down fairly frequently, but it is up and running most of the time, and you can mess around with it to learn about the functionality. Harvard actually also has a Dataverse testing site and is a very, very similar implementation to what we're doing here. And so we can see if we can find that real quick and share it out for you. That would be another good option.
And I've shared the link to the actual repository. That is not the sandbox or production repository, but that would give you a good indication of what the interface looks like that the user would sort of interact with. And I will say that the idea of having a space to play around or practice with the content or with the interface is something we will be doing at the Data Symposium in November at Baylor. Part of that symposium will be dedicated to an in-depth training for those representatives who are sent to the symposium to learn about this, with the idea that they will be sort of training others when they go back to their institutions as well.
And I've entered the demo Dataverse site that Harvard runs into the chat window, which would be a good place to test things out. So Santi, Katie asks if there will be a metadata field to denote the funder in the case of external sponsors.
I am confident there is. I cannot remember the exact field in which it occurs because there are lots of possibilities, but I will put the link here and we'll search quickly, Katie, to see if I can find that specific field.
Yeah, I'm confident that it's there. There are also fields for including identifiers like orchids for authors and possibly even grant numbers, although I shouldn't say that because I can't remember for certain. Oh, and Ray, thank you, Ray. There is, in fact, a field for funder in the default metadata.
And there also is there are fields designated just for grant agencies and grant numbers as well.
Good.
So it's can be quite exhaustive if you would like it to be, but we hope it's also flexible enough to meet the needs of various users.
can we generate reports out of Dataverse that list all the data sets by institution or faculty? Yes, and there is an API for Dataverse that allows you to generate reports. We've been generating them here internally, and we'll do that actually on a periodic basis. We're thinking monthly at this point, that we will share with the data repository librarians on a monthly basis to let them know, exactly what you're saying, lists of data sets that have been contributed over the past month by folks at their institution, and you'll be able to see department or other things like that. There's also the ability, Dataverse is really primarily set up, not exclusively, but primarily set up as a kind of self-deposit repository. It's very self-service oriented. Researchers can come in and create their own Dataverse and put data sets into it. But there is the ability, but you could also, we hope we've set it up in such a way that librarians could provide a kind of mediated deposit experience. But even for those self-deposit researchers, we want for librarians to be able to contact them and be in contact with them to make sure they know that there's support available through the library. And that will be possible through these reports that we generate. It's also possible just through the interface itself to contact data set owners and Dataverse owners to offer guidance or help. But I think on the API question, we've been generating reports out of the API. I think a good future webinar could be some instruction on how to use the Dataverse API locally to generate those reports for yourself so that you can customize them and do other stuff with it too. These are great questions. We have plenty of time, so keep them coming. Mm-hmm. Right. It looks like I just shut it down with that invitation. So if there are no other questions right now, then we will wrap things up after a good hour. We really appreciate everybody calling in and listening to what we have to say and asking so many great questions. Again, there will be multiple opportunities throughout the fall and in the spring to learn about the repository, to get training, and to learn more just about research data and research data management generally. So we hope you'll keep your eyes peeled and keep on top of those opportunities. We also want you to contact us if you have questions later on. And we'll be happy to talk with you. If you are interested in getting started, then contact us as soon as possible through that support@tdl.org link, and we will get in contact with you and get that ball rolling with the MOU and with Shibboleth integration, because both of those things will need to be put in place before you can start offering this to your faculty and staff. And we have one message coming in. I don't want to cut it off too soon. Okay. We will be, again, we will share out these slides to the attendees who registered for the webinar, and the recording will be available through the TDL website on the TDL YouTube channel. So feel free to share those as necessary. And again, if you have questions at all, please get in contact with us. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.